thinking better and thinking together about life's most important issues. A place to finally meet in the middle, to think freely and reasonably about the big questions of life. This is Thinker Sensitive. Welcome to the second episode of our season on the question of God. My name is Ryan Ragazine, and I am honored to be your host. For those of us who were born in Detroit, Michigan, the Motor City, the automotive industry has always been a source of great pride. It's a reflection of who we are as people, a testament to our work ethic, our toughness, our resiliency, and our fortitude. Almost all of my family on my mom's side, including my grandfather, worked for what we in Michigan call the Big Three: Chrysler, GM, and Ford. And after my dad retired from the ATF, he worked for GM for several decades. Much to the chagrin of native Detroiters like myself, however, the first automobiles were actually produced in Europe. Steam-powered vehicles were the vehicle of choice early on, but electric automobiles were also quite popular at first. The creation of the gasoline engine automobile is typically credited to Carl Benz and Gottlieb Daimler of Germany. But it was Henry Ford who made the gas-powered motor vehicle accessible to working-class families everywhere, transforming the automobile from a luxury to a necessity. With the introduction of the Model T in 1908, Ford succeeded in his mission to produce an affordable, efficient, and reliable automobile for everyone. Within a decade, nearly half the cars in the United States were Model Ts. The incredible popularity and demand led Ford to develop mass production methods, including giant production plants. And in 1913, the world's first moving assembly line for automobiles was built. Like with motor vehicles, which have a long and storied history of development, the question of God also has a rich history. And similar to how the nature and design of automobiles have evolved over the years in relation to changing social, economic, and cultural concerns, like with the more recent emphasis on energy-efficient vehicles, for example, the question of God has also developed over time. In the primitive history of Western civilization, the concept of divinity was often conflated with concepts of space. Matter and material objects were divinized and understood as gods. The early history of human civilization in the West was defined by both pantheism, the idea that the universe is God and God is the universe, and polytheism, the idea that there are many or several different gods. In the history of the question of God, the arrival of classical Greek philosophy represented a key paradigm shift in the West. Plato and Aristotle moved Western civilization from polytheism to monotheism. This is seen in the famous trial of Socrates, who was sentenced to death, at least in part, because of his denial of the many deities of Greek mythology. Whereas Plato's view of God was more in line with panentheism, the idea that part of God is in the universe and part of God is outside of the universe, Aristotle's view of God was more in line with deism, the belief in a divine creator or organizer who does not intervene in world history. Either way, both figures push the Western world towards classical theism, the belief in a single supreme being and creator of the universe. one who possesses certain natural or non moral attributes, like omniscience, omnipresence, omnipotence, immutability, eternality, and usually impassibility. In case you're not familiar with these terms, omniscience is the idea that God is all knowing. Omnipresence is the idea that God is everywhere at the same time. Omnipotence is the idea that God is all powerful. Immutability is the idea that God is unchanging. Eternality is the idea that God has always been and always will be. And impassibility is the classical Greek idea that God is indifferent or unaffected or unfeeling or even unemotional. Classical theism marks the final stage of development in the evolution of the idea of God in secular or non religious Western history. Classical theism is the entry point or the bridge to the religious understandings of God found in the great world religions of the West, particularly in the Abrahamic faiths, that is, the religious traditions that are descended from Abraham, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In what are known as the positive world religions, we find a more developed and more conceptualized theism, with special emphasis given to the moral attributes of God, values, virtues, and characteristics. The religious conception of God tends to understand God in more personal terms. It's important to note that I have omitted Buddhism and Hinduism here. I'm limiting my brief summary of the history of the question of God to the West, primarily because I'm speaking to a Western audience, but also because there are many forms of Buddhism that ignore or disregard the question of God altogether. Hinduism, on the other hand, is so closely connected to the landscape of India that some scholars have been hesitant to define it as a world religion. Hinduism is also still tied to polytheistic understandings, even though it probably more closely resembles henotheism, the idea that there is one supreme God amongst other gods. Philosophy and theology have always been intertwined. Historically speaking, philosophy has always revolved around the question of God. There are several reasons for this, but I will limit my discussion here to just two of them. First, true objectivity is grounded solely in God, and classical philosophy was always about the sincere search for objective and universal truth. I'll unpack this idea more as we move forward. Second, the utility of all thinking and all study is grounded in God. The trustworthiness of the human mind, the order of the universe, the intelligibility of the universe, and the coherence between the structures and categories of the human mind and the structures and material processes and laws of the universe are all grounded in God. The question of God relates to the biggest questions of human life, the very questions philosophers have always been most interested in. Issues of origins, both cosmic and human. Issues of human identity, nature, meaning, and purpose. Issues of human thinking, knowledge, and understanding. Issues of good and evil. Issues of ultimate truth and reality. Issues of absolute values and priority structures. Issues of beauty. The issue of life after death, time, and eternity. The vast majority of the great historical philosophers believed in some form of God, and many of them devoted a considerable amount of time to fleshing out why they believed in a higher power and to parsing out the implications and consequences of such belief. The history of atheism is much more brief and much more narrow than the history of theism. Complicating matters is the fact that there is a lot of debate on this issue in philosophical, historical, and theological scholarship. So it's hard to make definitive statements here. What I can say is that there are certainly traces of atheism in classical Greek philosophy and nascent forms of atheism in antiquity, though it was a pretty unique view. With that said, there might be some good reasons for that. For instance, if you were an atheist in ancient times, you probably wouldn't want to make mention of this to other people. If it got out that you didn't believe in the gods, you may very well end up with a death sentence on your head. At any rate, there were forms of ancient atomism that could be defined as atheistic in nature. But again, this would have been a pretty extreme localized minority in the ancient Greek world. Atomism, by the way, is the idea that the universe or the material world or reality, from the most complex things to the most simple things, can all be reduced to individual atoms. From here, we can jump to the development of Enlightenment deism, which, though it affirmed the existence of God, it denied the existence of miracles and divine intervention. This deistic Unitarianism, as opposed to Trinitarianism, was actually quite common during the Enlightenment period. And it was probably held by a lot of the founding fathers of the United States. Though it should also be mentioned that most of the founding fathers possessed a general Judeo Christian worldview. Enlightenment deism functioned as a precursor to modern atheism. Like with ancient Greek philosophy, traces of atheism can be found in the late 1700s and into the 1800s, though it was still quite rare. It's not until the 20th century when atheism begins to become more relevant and starts to be taken more seriously. It's interesting, though. A lot of the prolific 20th century theologians that I've studied and that I've been influenced by don't talk much about atheism. This is largely due to the fact that during their lifetime, atheism wasn't all that relevant or popular, even considering the atrocities of the Holocaust and the Death of God movement in the 1960s. Today, atheistic belief is becoming more and more commonplace. If it wasn't taken very seriously in the 20th century, it certainly should be taken seriously in the 21st century. This up and coming philosophy is actually quite pervasive in pop culture, transmitted through movies, TV shows, music, and social media. Atheistic belief often corresponds with other popular trends and other common sentiments in our age. Negative views of religion, criticism of religious belief, disillusionment with religious institutions, and hostility towards the church are all growing rapidly, and atheism is growing with them. These trends will only strengthen and increase as time progresses, as they are much more prominent in the younger generations. So, what is the cause of atheism's growing popularity? I think the answer is multifaceted. There are many different reasons for this. Let me briefly list some of these as I conclude this episode. First, Human advancement pushes the need for God out of society. This is something that Dietrich Bonhoeffer understood in his own time. Second, the problem of evil in the 20th century brought disillusionment and disenchantment. Third, in the 21st century, the uncertain prospects of the future, the deterioration of the environment, depleting economic opportunities, etc., undercut the hope of religious belief. Fourth, both scientism and strict empiricism, concepts that I've defined and discussed in previous episodes, have been perpetuated rather uncritically in Western culture. Without recourse to or acknowledgement of the history of philosophy, including the philosophy of science, we have become more scientifically minded but less philosophically minded. And fifth, young people today are being influenced by agnostic and atheistic thought found in popular media, whether consciously or subconsciously. As I just mentioned, atheism's growing popularity also directly corresponds with religion's growing unpopularity. And to be frank, much of this is the fault of religion itself. Moral failures, failures in faithfulness, the recent history of cults, the disregard of justice and mercy, a polemical and judgmental spirit, hypocrisy, authoritarianism, the distrust of science, political identity, countercultural beliefs, and historical privilege and power are all worth mentioning here. We'll pick up with the importance of the question of God on the next episode. Thanks so much for listening. This episode, and all episodes of Thinker Sensitive, are available on thinkersensitive.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. Subscribe on your favorite podcast app today to listen to more thought-provoking content from Thinker Sensitive.